Looks good. There. Yeah, that's gonna be great.
Oh, it's cold. A little chilly out this morning. Man, where did the world go?
Sure is foggy today.
It feels like the world has been erased. You can't see very far at all.
Hey, you want to move a little bit? You're blocking my light. What little sunlight there is today. I'm trying to finish my drawing here.
I didn't realize I was in your way. I'm sorry, Al. Didn't mean to block your light. What you doing over there, Al?
Oh, fair question, Pastor Steve. Well, I was drawing a rainbow. Well, actually, because it's so foggy today.
I'm not quite sure I follow. You're drawing a rainbow on the sidewalk because it's foggy?
Well, yeah, Pastor Steve. On days when there's an actual rainbow in the sky, you can look at the sky to see it. On the days when it's too foggy, that's when you need a reminder of what the rainbow's all about.
You need a reminder of what the rainbow is all about. I'm not sure I understand. Al, are you trying to predict the weather for tomorrow?
Predict the weather? Oh, no, Pastor Steve. No, weather's much too hard to predict. Tell you the truth, weather's kind of flighty. You know, sometimes they call for sun, it turns out to be rainy. Sometimes they call for it to be warm, and it turns out to be cold. No, I'm talking about something much more sure than the weather. I'm talking about God's promises.
Okay, Al, I'm all for talking about God's promises, but what does that have to do with chalk? And what does it have to do with the fog in the sky today?
Alright, this seems like one of those times I'm gonna have to go extra slow with you today, Pastor Steve. Okay, I'm not drawing this chalk rainbow because it is foggy today, because that's the weather. It's because on days when it is foggy, sometimes we have a way of forgetting that God's promises last, and the rainbow is a sign of God's promise. You know what I'm talking about, right, Pastor Steve?
Oh, does it mean that because I believe in God, God will always give me good weather when I want to, go outside and play, and that God promises only to send rainy days when I'm already sleeping or I have to be inside somewhere, or that God will send a snow day when I want a snow day? Is it that God will give me the weather I want?
You know, Pastor Steve, for a pastor, it is amazing to me how spectacularly wrong that sentence was. No, God does not promise you to give you good weather when you want it, or save the bad weather for when you already have to be inside. And God doesn't promise you only enough snow that they cancel school for a snow day. In fact, God doesn't promise us the weather we want, but it's about God's being faithful even when other things like the weather are changing. God's promises are what stayed the same, but God hasn't promised to give us nice weather just because you want it, Pastor Steve. God isn't a genie. You know that, right?
Okay, you're right. I should know better. God's not a genie who grants me wishes and does whatever I want just because I say so or snap a finger. But what is this business about God's promises then? If you're not telling me God will give me whatever I want, and what does this have to do with you and the chalk?
Okay, alright, at least we're making a little bit of progress because you know that God is not a genie. But alright, this is all about the story about what happened after the great flood, you know, with Noah and the ark, and all the animals, and about the promise that God made. And the promise has to do with the rainbow, right? You know that story?
Oh no, I know that Bible story, right? The guy who God tells him to build a big giant boat and to put animals of every kind on there because a flood is coming, and putting all these animals on the boat will keep them safe when the flood waters come over all the earth, right? Yeah, I know that story. The story about the guy with the boat. What does that have to do with chalk?
Not about chalk, Pastor Steve. About the rainbow. Okay, alright. I'm glad you remember that Noah is supposed to build a big boat. Yeah, that's what I just said. Right. Good for you. Gold star for you, Pastor Steve. But no, I mean, I'm glad you know that part of the story and that all the animals go on the boat. Right. But when the flood comes, and then at the end, when the flood waters subside, you remember what God says at the end, right? This is the whole point of the story, right? You know what happens at the end after the flood and after the animals are on the boat and they can come off safe, right? You know about the end of the story, right?
After the rain starts, Noah invented the umbrella? Is this the story of how Noah invented the umbrella?
No, Pastor Steve. Okay, all right. The story involves Noah, but to be clear, Noah is not the hero of the story. It's really about God. And at the end of the story, after the flood subsides, God's promise to Noah, and not just to Noah, but to all creation, to all the other people in Noah's family, and to all the animals, and to the earth itself, God's promise is, never again am I going to do things this way. I'm never going to wipe everything out like I did with the flood. Instead, I'm going to love you even when you're difficult to love. I'm going to stick it out with you all. And my promise to you all is I'm putting my bow up in the clouds. You know, the rainbow.
Oh, that's what you mean about the rainbow. So the rainbow is a sign that God made a promise, and that the promise that God makes is that after the flood had happened, God says, I'm never going to flood the earth and destroy everything like that again. Never again will I wipe out everybody, even if sometimes we are stinkers, even if we hurt each other or break the rules or are mean to each other. God's way of solving that problem, of dealing with the ways we hurt each other, is he's not gonna to wipe us out anymore. And the rainbow, you're saying, is meant to remind us?
Yeah, the rainbow in the sky is a sign for us now. It's something that reminds us God's promise that God's never going to destroy the whole earth like that again. God's not going to deal with the problem of the ways we hurt each other by just wiping everybody out. God's going to have to love us through it. That means forgiving. That means eventually sending Jesus, who deals with all the ways we hurt each other, not by zapping us or wiping us out, but by taking the worst we can do and bearing it on the cross for us. Jesus is eventually what God does to deal with our wrongdoing rather than wiping us out every time we deserve it.
Okay, so the rainbow is a reminder of God's promise, but is it a reminder for God? Is God gonna forget? Like, do you think, like, if God wakes up one morning without, like, having a cup of coffee, God might forget not to zap us and send a flood again or something like that? Does God need to have a rainbow in order to remind God not to zap us?
Now, you wait there just a second there, Pastor Steve. You think about that. Do you think that it's God who needs reminding? Do you think that God is going to forget that God's promise is never to destroy the earth again with a flood? I don't think so. I don't think it's that God needs a reminder. I don't think God ever needs morning coffee to help wake up in the morning either. That's you, Pastor Steve. No. What God gave us a rainbow for is so that we would remember, no matter what else happens, God's promise is, I will never destroy the whole earth again like I did with the flood. When you see the rainbow, you can remember, we can remember, you and me, everybody else, God made a promise. And the thing about God's promises is, God never breaks a promise. Sometimes God surprises us with how God keeps it, sometimes in ways we never expected. But God always keeps God's promises.
Okay. So, like, you're saying that, like, just like when I stepped out and saw the sky was all foggy, and then it almost felt like the whole world was disappearing. I could have wondered, like, is God getting rid of us? Is God erasing the world? Is it all going to go away? And the rainbow in the sky is a reminder of that promise God made. And so you, on a day like today, you drew a rainbow so that I'd remember, anybody who would walk past would remember that that's not how it works. God's not going to forget that promise, and God's not going to break the promise. When I need the reminder that it's never going to be to destroy the whole earth again, God's not going to wipe everything out, but God promises to make all things new, the rainbow will be a reminder for me. I like that.
Yeah, I really think God knows us pretty well. God knows sometimes we need reminders, both that God made a promise and also that God's promises are different than the kinds we make. Sometimes we make promises and we really mean to keep them, and then something happens and, you say, I'll meet you at 12 o'clock and we'll go have lunch, and then you're running late or there's a traffic jam and you're not going to be there on time. You have to break the promise. Or sometimes people are mean and they intentionally break their promises. Or sometimes people do their best and they just can't do what they promised. But that's not how it is with God's promises. The rainbow's a reminder. Not just that God made a promise, but that God's promises are different. God's promises are unbreakable, and God promises never to wipe out all creation like with that flood all that time ago. If we stop the story of Noah with just there's a guy with a boat and a bunch of animals, we haven't gotten to the good news at the end. And the good news is about God's unbreakable promises.
So, the story about God calling Noah to build the boat isn't just about Noah doing a good job, and it's not even really a story about just where the rainbows come from. It's a story about God's promises to help get us through in the times when we really kind of wonder if God can be trusted. Especially, like you say, if we've come through a time when somebody else makes a promise and they can't keep it to us, whether they mean to or whether it's by accident. But seeing the rainbow helps us to remember that even on the days when it looks so foggy, it feels like the world is disappearing, getting swallowed up in all that fog, God promises to keep us safe and to make all creation new, just like after the flood. Hey, what do you know? You see the sky's clearing up, Al.
Yep, what do you know indeed? Blue skies and the fog clearing away. Eventually it happens. God's promise is true all the time. Sometimes we just need the extra reminders.
Well, I'll tell you what, Al. Even though the blue sky now reminds me that even the scariest times God's promise is going to hold true through, I know me. And sometimes I get forgetful, even when you've helpfully drawn a picture to help remind me what I need. What if we drew the words? What if we wrote the words, God's promises are forever, right by your rainbow, so the next time I walk past your drawing, I'll know what it means.
I like your thinking, Pastor Steve. We write the words, God's promises are forever. We'll know. We'll remember, maybe you will too, that God's promise is never to destroy the whole world again, but instead that God promises to go through the difficult times with us, and that eventually God is willing to go all the way to a cross for us because he loved us, rather than wiping out the world with the flood or anything else. That's good news. All right, let's pick out a piece of chalk and let's get writing, all right?
Okay, let's see. F O
Don't get the R.
R E V E R.
Think you should add an exclamation point, Pastor Steve.
Okay. There we go. What do you think, Al?
Looks good to me. Good reminder. God's promises are forever.
That's news I'm going to remember in my head. I'm going to take it with me wherever I go. What do you think about that, Al?
Wow, cool. I'm glad you'll take the news of God's love and God's promises that last forever with you. See you later, everybody.
Hey, friends. Can we talk a little bit more, maybe without the chalk? It was fun to get to see Al, and it's always fun to be reminded of something that he has to tell us. But I want to also make sure you know, maybe so I can remember it too, that there's something important about that story that gets us through our day-by-day lives too. Sometimes we hear a story about like Noah and the flood and can think, well, that's a very interesting story from a very long time ago, and it doesn't have anything to do with how I live my life, right? I mean, ordinary day, you're not asked to build a giant boat. Ordinary day, you probably run across your pets, maybe a dog, a cat, a guinea pig, something like that, but not collecting all the animals of the world. And most days, even if it's a really, really big thunderstorm, doesn't look like it's going to wash away everything. So what does a story like this mean for us? Well, I think at least today, I want you to know just what Al reminded us of at the end. God's promises are forever. And that means that when God makes a promise, we can count on it, even though, let's be honest, you and me, sometimes other people who make promises in our lives Sometimes they do a really good job keeping them. Sometimes they can keep them for a long time and then something happens and they can't. And sometimes people's promises seem like they don't last very long at all. That's the world that we live in. One of the things that we're talking about in church today is that sometimes the promises we make to each other in families, sometimes life gets really tough and sometimes people can't keep the promises that they make to each other. Sometimes it happens with families, with moms and dads, and they get divorced. Sometimes it happens when parents promise the kids, we'll go to the amusement park today, and then it rains and you can't go because it's closed. Or we promise we're going to go on vacation and then COVID hit and things got canceled last year or the summer before. Things like that happen in life, and it's worth us being honest about it rather than pretending it doesn't happen. Sometimes people in our lives do their very, very best, and sometimes they can keep promises even when it's really, really difficult. And sometimes the people in our lives who make promises, sometimes even when they really mean to, they can't keep the promises that they wanted to for us. And that can let us down. Sometimes it's worth remembering that God loves not just you and me, God loves the other people in our lives who make promises and are doing their very, very best to keep them even when sometimes life happens and they can't. And that God loves me still, God loves you still, even when you and I are the ones who make promises and for whatever reason we can't keep them. I'm not saying that we should go around promising a bunch of stuff and then trying to break those promises or trying not to keep them. If you tell somebody, I'll be there for you, be there for them. If you tell somebody, I'm going to love you forever, do everything in your power to show up for them. But I also want you to know the really important difference between God and people is that sometimes people, we just can't. Sometimes we're too tired or don't have ideas or run out of strength or feel like we just don't know how to solve problems. But God's promises are forever. And so even if you've lived through times when you had to make a commitment or a promise to somebody and it didn't last, or when somebody else made you a promise and you felt left down, whether it was the rain canceled your plans or somebody promised you something really important and did their very, very best and couldn't keep it. I want you to know when God makes you a promise, you can trust it. Every time we see the rainbow in the sky, God tells us you can be reminded God's promises are forever. And even though other things in our lives change, and even the shape and the look of our families change, sometimes the people you're friends with in one grade might not be the friends you have in the next grade. Even if you promise each other at summer break, I'll be your friend forever, sometimes those things change. We don't mean them to happen, but they do. But I want you to know, God promises you belong to God forever. God promises you are beloved and claimed forever. And that part of the way God shows us that God means business is the rainbow, like in the Noah story. And every time we see the sign of the cross, we're reminded too. That's what God was willing to do to be sure to keep a promise to us. God was willing to take on death itself and then rise in resurrection life in Jesus, so that God would be faithful to keeping the promise. So you are beloved and you belong in God's family always. And even though sometimes when other people make us promises, we're not sure, can I trust you? Because I've been let down by other people who made promises and couldn't keep them. When God makes a promise, always means always. You belong in God's family always. You are beloved. And God promises never to wipe out all creation with a flood like happened in the Genesis story. But instead, God promises to bear with us and to struggle with us even though we keep messing up. That God is willing to love us even when it meant the hard way of going to a cross rather than wiping things out. I want you to remember today, and I'm going to do my best to remember too for myself, God's promises are forever. God's promises are unbreakable. And that's something we can take with us, whatever else is going on in our lives. Noah's story isn't just a weird or funny Bible story from a long time ago. It reminds us, even when we feel let down by other stuff that happens in life, God's promises to you, to me, to all creation, they're forever. Hey, thanks for this extra talk. Blessings to you.